Hello and welcome to myNewsWrap, news from the SAP Microsoft ecosystem. So we had a little break over the holiday weeks. I hope you all could re-energize during the last few weeks, and now we are getting back on track with the regular schedule of this podcast, video podcast, news format, however you want to call it. Okay. So let's start what happened in the last few weeks. I mean, it was a bit more quiet, of course. It was in between the years and now things are picking up again, but I think I have quite some interesting news for you. So let's switch to what we have. First of all, there is the generic news part about SAP. And there was one announcement that crossed my path on Twitter and LinkedIn. And that's when an event that's happening at the end of January called Rise with SAP, the introduction. Absolutely no idea what that's all about. It's with Christian Klein. It's free, so save the date and join in. Really interesting. There is also, I think, a Q&A session afterwards, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, that's something that I'm looking forward to, because I'm really curious what will be announced there within this format. So, quite interesting news at the beginning of 2021. Now, let's go to SAP Cloud Platform next. So what happened there? There was quite some things happening around CI/CD and DevOps topics. So there is a quite extensive blog post series by Marco Lomacz. I hope I pronounce it correctly. With respect to the continuous integration and deployment on SAP Cloud Platform. So as you can see here, there are some blogs that came out now during the first week of January about setting up continuous integration, integrating, and so on and so forth. So I think if you are working in an area that's really interesting. And there is also another news around the topic of CI/CD on SAP Cloud Platform, on the CI/CD service on SAP Cloud Platform, that I want to bring to your attention. And that is that the SAP Cloud Platform continuous integration and delivery now also supports Git repositories that are hosted on-premise. I referenced within the show notes this tweet, which itself references the documentation on help.sap.com. So if you are using an on-prem Git repository and you want to use SAP Cloud Platform CI/CD, then you should take a look at this help.sap.com reference. There will also be a blog post. It did not yet cross my path. I think it's in preparation, so looking forward to that one. I will hopefully see it and then reference it in a consequent edition of this myNewsWrap. Then another topic that's not super sexy, but that's quite necessary and that is of interest of you, certainly, and that's migrating applications from Neo to Cloud Foundry, or let's say to the multi-cloud SAP Cloud Platform. And maybe you already came across a blog by Juval Morad, a blog post by Juval Morad on the SAP community. He already blogged about migrating Fiori applications that have an ABAP backend from Neo to Cloud Foundry using the SAP Business Application Studio. That was a step-by-step description. And this is now kind of a follow-up blog post, or a blog post concerning a different scenario with respect to Fiori apps in targeting a different runtime. So if you are doing Fiori stuff, if you have stuff on Neo, sooner or later, I guess you have to move to Cloud Foundry due to different reasons. Then I hope this blog post is helpful. As far as I have seen, it's still quite some stuff to do that is manual, but I think these blog posts are really quite helpful in order to guide you through the process. Now, what's next on SAP Cloud Platform, or let's be more precise, on the area of the Cloud Application Programming Model? There have been some blog posts that came out between the years. So one is about consuming REST services with the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model. Nothing brand new. And for all the SAP CAP gurus out there, nothing that will make them nervous. But for those who are starting with Cloud Application Programming Model in 2021, this is a nice blog post that gives you insight on how you can consume REST services, so external services within your SAP Cloud Application Programming Model, because that's definitely a use case. Next, what's also nice to see around the Cloud Application Programming Model, let's say, ecosystem, the traction of, let's say, community contributions is getting more and more. There is one point that I want to highlight, but before I come to that, sorry, I forgot that one. There is also a blog post by Thomas Young on a new, let's say, model sample that's available on GitHub on the SAP samples page. It's a bit more of a complex sample with respect to the entities and the relations and the Fiori annotations that are used. So if you want to see a bit more complicated example, then I think this is a good stop for you here on GitHub SAP samples. Now back to the point that I teased before about community contributions. There is one contribution by Holger Schäfer, who used plant UML in order to render JSON diagrams. That's, I think, also quite fitting with respect to this more complex sample by Thomas Young, because this really allows you to show all the objects and their relations and so on. The GitHub repo has a great README file, so this is really an extensive description, what's possible, what's shown, how to interact, how to do the things within Visual Studio Code. There are a lot of, let's say, small videos in there that guide you through what you can do and what's possible. So if you are in the CAP area, that repo is definitely worth a look. Okay, so next stop, Kyma. There are also some news around Kyma. One thing specifically targeting on how to interact with functions and how to develop functions, how to set up CI/CD with Kyma functions. And with the last release of the managed Kyma on trial, so it was 1.17, you might have seen that there's also the option that you can host your source code on GitHub and then pull that stuff into Kyma functions. So there is a dedicated, let's say, type of Kyma function that tells you I do not have the usual inline editor within Kyma, but that allows you to fetch the code from the outside. And I referenced the repository that describes in detail what you have to do in order to make that work, in order to make that push and set up the CI/CD pipeline for deploying functions, Kyma functions to be more precise, from a GitHub repository. So that's definitely worth a look. Then there is also one very, very, very nice and very helpful tutorial by Marius Obert with respect to Kyma service accounts. So I'm quite sure if you have been working with Kyma on the trial, you know that it's a little bit cumbersome with respect to the config file because the credentials or the token within the config file expires every 8 hours. And so if you start working, it might even be on the same day that the file expires. So you have to refresh your kubeconfig file. And this developer tutorial describes how you can kind of put a workaround in place in order that you do not need this refresh every 8 hours. However, be aware that this is maybe not the most secure way to do things, but it's working, and for development, I think it's fine. Then, in the more broader context of Kyma, I came across a post by Microsoft. I referenced that here in the Kyma section because I think it's naturally linked to Kubernetes. There is a very, very good blog post about threat metrics for Kubernetes. So if you're using Kyma in a non-managed environment, then you are definitely dealing with Kubernetes and all the work around that. And this article gives you a very good overview about the threat metrics and the things that you have to take into account to make your Kubernetes deployment more secure. What are the attack vectors that you have to think about? What are the tactics in order to mitigate all the threats and so on? So yeah, not only relevant for Kyma, but of course closely linked to Kyma. Then finishing this SAP section, I have one message that's not so positive, to be honest, by Jörg Brandeis, who is kind of expert in the SAP HANA, SQL Script, BW area, who does a lot of training there. And for the training, he used the SAP HANA Express Edition on hyperscalers, and there was a launcher that was available, so you could basically click and deploy your HANA there without too much ado. Now this, with the 1st of 2021, this vanished from all hyperscaler platforms. Reasons one could only, well, do guesses why that happened. So the HANA Express Edition itself is still there. So for as a Docker image or for your local deployment. But these launchers, they have vanished, so it's now a little bit more cumbersome to set things up. But if you are relying on that, that's a really important message. So he also referenced here, I think, an official statement from SAP. So basically the HANA offerings on the hyperscalers have been deprecated or removed, completely removed. So not a that great start, I think, for Jörg into the new year. Nevertheless, the Docker image is still there, so you can deploy that one. Okay, then let's switch to the Microsoft part of the house. There have been some, let's say, Outlook posts, as one would expect at the beginning of a year, what will happen with software development in 2021 and beyond. Very nice wrap-up that came out yesterday on the Microsoft blog area. So there are some highlights in there with respect to talent management, with respect to building up a resilience, with respect to, of course, the workplace flexibility or remote first collaboration that is still in place, and I guess it will be still in place until mid of the year at least. There is also some stuff about open source and low-code solutions. So nice overview, nice point of view blog post about software development from the point of view of Microsoft. Then there was another announcement that came out the day before yesterday, indeed. And that surprised me. So last year, I think I already referenced that Microsoft had an offering called Microsoft Cloud for I think, health, which was for me kind of normal because they had a lot of engagement within the health sector with respect to enabling frontline workers with Microsoft 365, Power Apps, and so on and so forth. And they kind of productized that effort. Now they brought up another Microsoft Industry Cloud, and that's the Microsoft Industry Cloud for Retail. I referenced the article that highlights that new Industry Cloud from Microsoft side in the show notes. I think that's quite interesting because the Industry Cloud area, as I think stressed quite often last year, is also a big topic for SAP. And well, I'm really interested and curious to see how Microsoft and SAP will go along in the future with those topics. Having in the back of my head the SAP Embrace stuff that, well, there's, I think, some, let's say, friction between Microsoft and SAP, and now they are really, from my perspective, competing in this emerging industry cloud area. So let's see if the friction gets less or more. Looking forward. Perhaps the rise of SAP at the end of January will give an answer to that. Perhaps not. Who knows? Okay, then let's get away from those politics and let's go back to technology. Usually easier to handle. There is one big news that came out last year with respect to Azure Functions, and that's custom handlers within Azure Functions. And I referenced a YouTube video by Anthony Chu, who is a product manager in the Azure Functions area. He's dealing especially with a lot of stuff that is non-C# or non.NET Azure Functions, which is cool. And he gave a little 20-minute video about using those custom handlers. Now, what does that mean? Within Azure Functions, you have different runtimes that you can use, like C#, like TypeScript, like JavaScript, like Python, like PowerShell. But what if you want to use, like, let's say, Go or Rust or Ruby? How can you get those stuff running within Azure Functions? And the answer is custom handlers, which allows you to containerize, or let's say wrap your custom language and make it accessible to the Azure Function runtime, and getting all the benefits from the Azure Function runtime, including the different binding types and so on. And this video gives you an overview how this works with Go, also with a lot of background information. So it's not just we make a Hello World Go example and then everything works. But there is a lot of points mentioned within this video that are super valuable. So if you are in the area of Azure Functions, this is a must watch. There is also a blog post that came out that was quite interesting because it, I wouldn't say abuses, but touches quite an edge case of custom handlers. And that's if you have an Express.js middleware app and you want to migrate it to Azure Function, you usually have to rewrite it. And that's also the recommendation by Microsoft. But of course, you can now use custom handlers in order to not adapt your Express.js middleware and still benefit from Azure Functions. I referenced that the blog post here. If you want to take a look at that one, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure if it's the way to go, but I think there are scenarios, there are use cases where this makes sense. Then for the, let's say, more DevOps operational folks following this show, I referenced a blog post about Azure Durable Functions for PowerShell. So I think the typical use case for that one is really automating operations. And yeah, this blog post shows a bit about how to deal with PowerShell and durable functions, because there are some limitations. So it does not have the full functionality as you would have it in C# or in JavaScript. And that's also partially by intention, as far as I understood. Okay, then Anthony, I have to reference him again, and I like that. He was quite busy over the holidays, and he also brought up a little utility, little npm package on how to trigger Azure functions locally from an event grid in Azure, which is a bit of a pain. He also referenced that in the tweet that he set out, because you had to use ngrok in order to make that work. And with this tooling from him, it's now easy as cake to set that up. So yeah, quite productive weeks for Anthony over the holidays. Then there is one other tweet that I want to highlight by Mikhail Shilkov, who is around the area of serverless on all clouds. And he updated the topic of cold starts with respect to AWS Lambda, Azure Functions, and Google Cloud Functions or Google Cloud Run. Especially because of the new offering of AWS, where you can now deploy containers to Lambda. And he took a look at that one, because there has been quite some rumor around, well, if I have now a container and it's a big container, what happens with the initial startup time of my serverless AWS Lambda function? What's not so nice to see is that there is some room for improvement with respect to Azure Functions, to be honest, with the startup times. So yeah, AWS is leading the pack there. We have to be honest. Nevertheless, I like Azure Functions. Okay, then some different stuff from the area of Microsoft. I already highlighted the sustainability topic with respect to software development last year. And here I want to highlight another blog post by Microsoft that came out just before Christmas on how does the language that you choose change the carbon impact of client UI apps. So I think that's one of the raising an interesting topics of the future. And yeah, Microsoft is really doing there quite some stuff and supporting you a lot. So yeah, take a look at that. So what do we have more? There is one video that I want to highlight that's about Azure API management, giving you some insight on how to mock API responses, how to do throttling within the API management. Quite important topic because from my perspective, even if you do Azure Functions and if you want to expose them to the outside for development purpose, yeah, you will probably directly expose them. But when it comes to real world productive scenarios, I guess you will stick to API management in order to have that as a gateway toward your functions. And I think that's quite useful also for other APIs that are running on Azure. Okay, then let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. So the SAP Embrace area. What do we have there? Holger Bruchelt made a head start this year with his SAP on Azure video podcast. He already pushed one out last week, so not a that long vacation for Holger, but definitely a super cool video episode on Azure DevOps and SAP Cloud Platform. So how to bring Azure DevOps together with deploying, I think it was a UF5 app, a pure UF5 app, to SAP Cloud Platform, making use of Project Piper. And Daniel Meixner presented this topic, and it's really a super nice walk through Azure DevOps and how to combine it with SAP Cloud Platform. So definitely no wasted time there. Take your time and watch that video. It's absolutely worth it. Okay, then one more blog post around the topic of bringing SAP and, let's say, Microsoft together. I won't even try to pronounce the name of Bart, who is an SAP employee. He also brought out quite some blogs in the last weeks about bringing together SAP Cloud Platform and Microsoft on a more, let's say, infrastructural level or more on low-level offerings. And this post is about integrating and connecting to a Microsoft SQL server from SAP Cloud Platform. That's really, really cool and interesting in the integration area, making the connection with the JDBC connectivity from an on-prem system to the cloud. And I think that's also something that's not that unusual from my perspective, because a lot of customers do not only have SAP and HANA in their house. So if you are working in that area, take a look at that blog post. I hope that supports you. Okay, then let's switch to the learning area, to the educational area. So we are starting 2021. So we have our New Year's resolutions. Perhaps we want to dig into Azure. Perhaps we want to learn something about Azure. Yeah, and there is a blog post that supports you there. How can you learn Azure in 2021 by Thomas Maurer, who is working at Microsoft. And this blog post is really valuable because it lists all the different learning resources that are available from Microsoft. It's not only the learning center, I mean, that's the central hub, so to say, but there's also the Azure Architecture Center, there's the Cloud Adoption Framework, there's the Migration Center, there's the well-architected framework. There are patterns, there are reference architectures, and so on and so forth. And he really listed them all here. So that's definitely something that you should bookmark, because this list is really super helpful. Then there is also one thing, if you want to make your hands dirty with different topics in the Microsoft area, there is a page that is the central entry point for Microsoft Cloud workshops. So all the workshops that you can get and that are usually for free are also listed here, and they are all referenced to GitHub repos where the workshop is described and where you have the resources of the workshop. So you do not need to wait until the workshop is offered. You can directly dive into, let's say, app modernization, let's say cloud native application, how to use cognitive services, how to use Azure DevOps. I think we had that today, right? So that's also a nice entry point if you do learning and researching. Then let's switch my tabs here on the browser a bit. So there is also one new format that came out yesterday. That is Azure Kubernetes Services 0 to Hero. I referenced the episode 1 there by Richard Hooper and Gregor Suttie. I think both are MVPs of Microsoft. And they start their journey really from zero with respect to Azure Kubernetes Services. So I'm a big fan of Azure Functions. I think they are really top-notch. But I also know that you need Kubernetes services in some scenarios. And if you want to get, with 2021, a big dive into the topic, I think this video series will come in handy. And then I also have another, let's say, educational session thing that's not related to any vendor, but that is super valuable. I already saw some stuff from there. It's by Golo Roden. It's in German, I have to say. Golo Roden is one of the founders of the Native Web GmbH in Germany, who is doing a lot of stuff around CQRS-based systems using JavaScript. And he has a lot of formats with a lot of short, quite concise videos on CQRS, on programming languages, on architecture, on domain-driven development. It's always around about 5 to 8 minutes, and it's coming out, I think, really daily. It's with different focus, with different areas. It's also, I think if I go to the channel, let's see, you can also see it from the, let's say, color coding. If it's more architectures daily, if it's a developers daily, I think there are more topics around there that he's bringing out, and he's really bringing that out on a daily basis. It's easy to digest. It's 5 minutes, 6 minutes, super well explained. I really like that format. As I said, for those of you who are not German speaking, either you learn German or you cannot unfortunately watch those videos, but for the others, that's really great. Unfortunately, currently nobody commutes, so this would be really perfect fitting into the daily commutes. But anyway, last topic for today, last but not least, developer productivity. One of the topics that I quite often have here is how to set up a Windows Terminal. There is another blog post by Gary Trinder about how to set up Windows Terminal and the WSL2, so the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 area, because you are then working in Linux, so it's a little bit different with respect to the tools that you can use, with respect to the fonts. Yeah, take a look at it. I mean, we are developers, I guess, so the terminal and the editors are our, let's say, living room, so we should make them as comfortable and cozy for us as we want it. And this is one blog post that might give you some inspiration on how to do things. Okay, so that was it for today's session about SAP and Microsoft, myNewsWrap. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I could bring up some interesting stuff for you. As I said, now again on weekly schedule, and I see you hopefully next week. Until then, have a nice Friday, have a nice weekend. Bye.